At the annual scholarship gala held in her late mother's name under crystal chandeliers and polite applause, Dennis Chapman smiled as he took the microphone. He thanked the donors. He praised the board. Then he turned to his wife. "With everything Crystal has been going through lately," he said gently, "the company needs steadier hands." Laughter, uncertain, scattered, rippled through the ballroom. Monica Hayes stood beside Crystal, fingers resting lightly on her arm. Dennis did not know the house audio system was still recording. And he did not know Crystal had already heard enough. If you believe justice doesn't need to shout to be real, stay with this story. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Stories travel differently across time zones. And if you stand for quiet strength over loud revenge, consider subscribing. Some truths unfold slowly, but they always surface. Crystal Chapman had never intended to become the kind of woman people described as formidable. She had intended simply to build something that worked. 12 years earlier, in a borrowed co-working space in Boston, she had sketched the first architecture of what would later become a billion-dollar health data infrastructure company. At the time, it had been nothing more than a stubborn idea. The hospitals needed cleaner data pipelines, insurers needed transparent analytics, and patients deserved records that did not disappear between systems. Crystal had written the first lines of code herself. She had taken meetings where men twice her age explained her own product back to her. She had accepted funding with terms she negotiated line by line, never raising her voice, never blinking first. She had kept notebooks, thick, black, unadorned notebooks, where she logged every promise, every deviation, every risk. She did not trust memory alone. She trusted documentation. By the time Chapman Health Analytics crossed the billion-dollar valuation mark, journalists called her visionary. Industry panels called her disciplined. Competitors called her relentless. Dennis called her brilliant. He had met her during the company's third year when she needed outside legal counsel to structure a complex acquisition. Dennis Chapman had been sharp, articulate, impeccably dressed in a way that signaled both competence and restraint. He understood regulatory frameworks instinctively. He knew how to calm investors with a single, well-placed sentence. Crystal had admired that. He admired her certainty. They married 2 years later. From the outside, their partnership looked seamless. At conferences, Dennis often stood slightly behind her, not overshadowing, not eclipsed. At board meetings, he spoke only when invited, his contributions precise and legally airtight. The board liked him. He translated Crystal's intensity into language they found comfortable. He made power look approachable. Monica Hayes entered Crystal's life even earlier than Dennis had. They met at a healthcare innovation summit in Chicago when Crystal's company was still fragile enough to break under one wrong contract. Monica had been working operations at a mid-sized biotech firm known for rescuing failing divisions and turning them profitable within quarters. She had an instinct for logistics and a talent for reading people's weaknesses without appearing to judge them. Crystal had needed someone who could see the blind spots she refused to acknowledge. Monica became that person. When Chapman Health Analytics expanded nationally, Monica joined as Chief Operating Officer. She managed growth while Crystal guarded vision. If Crystal was the architect, Monica was the structural engineer. They traveled together. They stayed in the same hotels. They ate late dinners, reviewing spreadsheets over wine. When Crystal's mother passed away after a long illness, Monica was the one who handled the internal memo, shielding Crystal from condolences she did not have the energy to receive. Trust, once established at that depth, rarely feels fragile. It feels permanent. In the present, Crystal's office overlooked the Charles River. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected a woman who favored tailored navy suits and minimal jewelry. Her desk was orderly: 2 monitors, a leather-bound planner, one open notebook with neat, deliberate handwriting. On the wall behind her hung a framed copy of the company's original incorporation document. She often glanced at it before major decisions. This morning, she noticed something small. A calendar alert for a board strategy session had been moved forward by 48 hours. The change was subtle, no explanation, no urgency marker, simply adjusted. She had not approved it. Crystal did not react outwardly. She clicked into the calendar metadata. The modification had been made from an executive-level administrative account. She made a note in her notebook. 10:14 a.m. board strategy moved. No prior discussion. Later that afternoon, she skimmed her inbox and noticed an email thread referencing restructuring models that she had not been copied on originally. Her name appeared only in a forwarded summary, as if she were being informed after groundwork had already begun. She reread the language: exploratory, preliminary, confidential. She leaned back slightly in her chair. From across the hall, laughter drifted from Monica's office. Dennis's voice followed low and measured. Crystal did not feel jealousy. She did not feel suspicion. She felt misalignment. It was a sensation she trusted more than emotion. At dinner that evening, Dennis described a potential expansion into European markets. His tone was animated, his gestures controlled. He asked Crystal if she thought the board might support a more aggressive timeline. "They'll want risk mitigation outlined first," she replied calmly. Monica nodded in agreement. "We can model that scenario." Their conversation flowed easily. Plates were cleared, wine was poured. No raised voices, no fractures visible. Yet later, as Crystal washed a single glass left in the sink, she replayed the day's small deviations in her mind. Calendar shifts, partial emails, language that implied preparation. She dried her hands, walked upstairs to her study, and opened her notebook again. 10:14 a.m. Board strategy moved. 2:37 p.m. restructuring thread. Late inclusion. Dinner discussion EU expansion linked to governance. She underlined the last word: governance. Crystal had always maintained majority voting control through a layered share structure. It was a safeguard she designed early when venture capital interest first surged. She believed founders should protect long-term direction from short-term pressure. Dennis had helped draft those protections. He knew them intimately. Across town, at a private club, where executives met discreetly, Dennis sat with Harold Whitaker, chairman of the board. Their conversation was not hostile. It was not conspiratorial in tone. It was careful. "Crystal's been carrying a tremendous load," Dennis said, folding his hands. "No one questions her brilliance. But sustainability matters." Harold nodded slowly. "Investors are asking about succession planning." "We'd be irresponsible not to evaluate contingencies," Dennis replied. He chose each word as though placing stones across a river. The narrator knew that Dennis did not yet see himself as a villain. He saw himself as pragmatic. Monica, seated in her car afterward, reviewed a draft document on her tablet governance adjustment framework. It outlined temporary delegation triggers under specific conditions: health incapacity, reputational threat. Her reflection in the windshield looked composed. Inside, her reasoning was quieter but sharper. Crystal was exceptional, yes, but companies outgrew founders all the time. Leadership evolved, controls shifted. It was natural. Crystal, meanwhile, sat alone in her study. She opened the company's bylaws. Her eyes moved steadily across clauses she could recite from memory. When she reached the section concerning temporary incapacity and delegated authority, she paused. The language was familiar, but a cross-reference had been added. She traced it with her finger. Amendment filed 3 weeks prior. Approved unanimously by the board. Her signature was there. Digitally affixed during a batch authorization session for routine updates. Crystal did not gasp. She did not call Dennis into the room. She turned to a fresh page in her notebook. Amendment Incapacity Clause Cross-Ref. Filed 3 WKs ago. Review scope. She closed the bylaws carefully and placed them back in their drawer. Outside, the river moved steadily in the dark. Crystal understood something with quiet clarity. Power rarely shifts in dramatic strokes. It moves in administrative edits, in polite meetings and clauses that appear harmless until activated. She rose from her desk, turned off the light, and walked down the hall toward her bedroom, where Dennis was already asleep. She watched him for a moment. His breathing was even, his face untroubled. Crystal did not yet know the full extent of what he and Monica were planning. But she knew this. The architecture she had built could not be taken in a single motion. And if someone intended to try, they would have to move through structures she understood better than anyone. She slipped into bed without waking him. In the dark, her mind did not race. It organized. The house was too quiet for a Thursday. Crystal noticed that first. Not the voices, those came later, but the absence of ordinary sound. No television murmuring from the den. No soft music from Monica's usual late-night playlists drifting down the hall. Even the hum of the kitchen refrigerator seemed distant, subdued. It was 11:42 p.m. Crystal had fallen asleep over quarterly projections and woken with a faint stiffness in her neck. Dennis was not beside her. She did not assume anything unusual. He often worked late. Monica sometimes stayed over after strategy sessions that ran long. Crystal rose, wrapped a light robe over her shoulders, and stepped into the hallway. A thin bar of light cut across the floor from the downstairs study. The study had glass walls facing the garden, but from the hallway it was partially concealed by a structural column. Voices carried differently there, muted, distorted, but distinct enough when one listened carefully. Crystal had no intention of listening. She was simply walking toward the stairs. Then she heard her name. "We can't let her catch wind of it yet," Dennis said. His tone was not heated. It was controlled, almost gentle. Crystal stopped mid-step. Monica responded, quieter but sharper. "She won't. She trusts the board process, and she trusts you." A pause. Crystal did not move closer. She did not need to. Dennis exhaled slowly. "Once the proxies are secured, it won't matter." The word proxies hung in the air like a dropped object. Crystal's fingers tightened slightly around the railing. Monica's voice again. "We trigger the temporary incapacity clause, only if we have to. Ideally, she steps aside, voluntarily. And if she doesn't, another pause, longer." Dennis answered. "Then we proceed." Crystal did not feel the rush of betrayal one might expect. What she felt was calibration. Her mind separated tone from content. They were not arguing. They were aligning. The narrator understood what Crystal did not yet fully grasp. This was not a spontaneous frustration. It was a coordinated strategy. Inside the study, papers shifted. The faint click of a pen. The low thud of something placed deliberately on the desk. Monica spoke again. "Harold's on board. He just wants investor reassurance." "If we frame it as founder fatigue," Dennis cut in gently, "not fatigue, sustainability. We're protecting her. Protecting her." Crystal nearly smiled at the phrasing. She stepped back silently before the floorboard beneath her could betray her position. She retreated down the hallway and into the guest bedroom at the far end of the house, closing the door without sound. Only then did she sit. Her breathing remained steady. She replayed the phrases. Proxies secured. Temporary incapacity clause. Trigger only if necessary. Proceed. Crystal reached for her phone. Not to call anyone, not to record. She opened her notes app and typed 11:47 p.m. D+M discussing proxies. Involuntary step-aside scenario. Incapacity clause mentioned explicitly. She saved the note. For several minutes, she simply sat on the edge of the bed, absorbing the structural implications rather than the emotional ones. Proxy votes required shareholder coordination. Temporary incapacity required either medical certification or board determination under specific thresholds. She had designed those thresholds. They were not easily activated, unless someone had prepared in advance. Downstairs, the study door opened. Footsteps moved toward the kitchen. Crystal remained still until she heard Monica's voice, softer, now almost sympathetic. "She'll never see it coming." Dennis did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice held something that might have been regret or calculation. "It's better this way." The refrigerator door opened. Glass clinked. Crystal did not wait to hear more. She rose and returned quietly to her bedroom, sliding under the covers just as Dennis entered moments later. He paused when he saw her awake. "You're up?" he asked lightly. Couldn't sleep, she replied. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. We were just finishing up some numbers with Monica. I heard. He froze for half a second, so slight it would have escaped most observers. Crystal did not look at him. Heard you two downstairs? She clarified calmly. The walls carry. Dennis relaxed, almost imperceptibly. Ah, sorry if we woke you. It's fine. He changed into sleepwear and slid into bed. Crystal turned onto her side, facing away. Dennis reached for her hand briefly. She allowed it. The narrator knew that Dennis interpreted her calm as ignorance. He believed that if she had understood the substance of the conversation, there would have been confrontation, accusation, anger. He did not know that Crystal had built an empire on silence before action. The next morning unfolded with familiar efficiency. Monica arrived early, dressed in charcoal gray, her expression composed. She handed Crystal a folder during the executive briefing. Draft proposal for European expansion, she said smoothly. Crystal flipped through the pages. The formatting was meticulous. Embedded within the financial projections, however, was a section titled Governance Transition Contingencies. It was subtle, almost academic in tone. Crystal looked up at Monica. You're anticipating volatility? She asked evenly. Just being thorough, Monica replied. Investors like contingency planning. Dennis entered the room, just then coffee in hand. Morning. Crystal held his gaze for a second longer than usual. Morning. The meeting proceeded without disruption. Crystal asked precise questions. She approved minor adjustments. She deferred a final decision pending further review. No one observing the room would have sensed fracture. Yet by mid-afternoon, Crystal requested a private session with Robert Klein, the CFO. He entered her office with visible caution. You wanted to see me, yes? Crystal said, gesturing for him to sit. I'd like a full report on current proxy distributions among minority shareholders. Robert blinked. That's unusual. So is a governance transition contingency draft embedded in an expansion model. His lips parted slightly. I'm not accusing anyone. Crystal continued calmly. I want data. He swallowed. Of course, I'll have it compiled. And Robert, yes, discretion. He nodded quickly. After he left, Crystal closed her office door and retrieved one of her black notebooks from the drawer. She wrote, proxy distribution audit immediately. Monica draft includes transition language. Dennis confident. She underlined the last word twice. Confidence she knew came from perceived advantage. Later that evening, while reviewing archived board minutes, Crystal noticed something else. 3 weeks ago, the same week the incapacity clause amendment was filed, Dennis had hosted a private dinner for 2 large minority shareholders. She had been traveling in Seattle. The dinner had not been on her calendar. It had not required her approval, but it had been strategic. Crystal leaned back in her chair. The pattern was emerging. Conversations, amendments, private meetings, draft proposals. None of it illegal in isolation, all of it directional. The narrator understood that Crystal now stood at the edge of knowledge. She did not yet have proof of conspiracy. She did not yet possess admissible evidence of intent. But she had something equally valuable. Timing. Downstairs that night, Dennis and Monica reviewed spreadsheets again. We're close, Monica said. Dennis nodded. Once Harold confirms the last proxy commitment, we call the special board session, and Crystal Dennis's jaw tightened slightly. She'll be given options. Upstairs, Crystal sat at her desk under a single lamp. She opened her laptop and began drafting an email, not to Dennis, not to Monica, but to an external law firm she had not used in years. Subject line Governance Review, Confidential. She did not send it yet. Instead, she saved it as a draft. Crystal Chapman did not move impulsively. She built sequences. And she understood now that whatever Dennis believed about her blindness was his first miscalculation, because she had heard enough. And she was no longer simply observing. She was preparing. The following week, Crystal Chapman did not alter her routine. She arrived at the office at 7:15 a.m. as she always did. She reviewed operational dashboards before most executives finished their first coffee. She responded to investor inquiries with measured clarity. She signed vendor agreements without hesitation. Outward continuity was her first shield. Inside, however, she had shifted into audit mode. By Tuesday afternoon, Robert Klein delivered the proxy distribution report she had requested. He entered her office carrying a slim binder, his usual composure slightly thinned at the edges. "I ran a current tally based on informal commitments and historical voting patterns," he said carefully. "Nothing official has changed yet." Yet Crystal repeated softly. Robert hesitated. "There's been increased outreach. Dennis has spoken with several minority holders in the past month." "Socially?" she asked. "Framed that way." Crystal opened the binder. Color-coded charts displayed percentages of voting shares, aligned historically with management-neutral positions and swing votes. Under a separate column, Robert had noted recent private dinners, conference calls, and informal check-ins. Crystal's eyes paused at 3 names. All 3 had attended the private dinner Dennis hosted while she was in Seattle. "Are these shareholders legally permitted to shift proxy designation without my notice?" she asked. "Yes," Robert said, "but formal documentation would be required before a board action." Crystal nodded once. "Has any such documentation been filed?" "No." "Has a special board meeting been requested?" "Not officially." Crystal closed the binder. "Thank you, Robert. I'll take it from here." He did not immediately stand. "Crystal," he said quietly, "is something happening?" She met his gaze. "Something is always happening, Robert. The question is whether it's transparent." He left with that answer. Once alone, Crystal pulled the company's amended bylaws from her drawer again. She reread the incapacity clause in full. The language was neutral on its face. In the event the chief executive officer is deemed temporarily unable to fulfill fiduciary duties, due to medical, psychological, or reputational impairment, the board may, upon majority proxy alignment, appoint an interim executive authority pending review. The cross-reference added 3 weeks ago expanded the definition of reputational impairment. Crystal traced the phrase with her finger. Reputational impairment, subjective, elastic. She closed the document and reached for her phone, not to call Dennis, not to confront Monica, but to search state statutes regarding fiduciary duty and wrongful removal of executive authority. She had written parts of her company's governance framework herself. But external legal context mattered. An hour later, she sat in a discreet conference room at Daniel Brooks's law office downtown. Daniel had represented her during the company's early acquisition years. He was older now, silver threading his dark hair, his manner as measured as ever. "You wouldn't be here unless something substantial was unfolding," he said after she finished outlining recent amendments and proxy outreach. Crystal did not dramatize. She presented chronology, amendment filed, proxy conversations, draft governance transition embedded in expansion proposal. Daniel listened without interruption. "Do you believe your husband is coordinating this?" he asked finally. "I believe he understands the structure well enough to use it," she replied. "And Monica Hayes. She co-authored the transition draft." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Intent will be difficult to prove without direct evidence of conspiracy," he said. "But procedural irregularities can be challenged." Crystal nodded. "I don't want to challenge prematurely," she said. "I want preservation." Daniel's eyes sharpened slightly. "You're asking about legal hold?" "Yes. You suspect evidence could be altered. I suspect planning predates disclosure." Daniel folded his hands. "If we initiate a legal hold formally, it signals confrontation. I don't want confrontation yet," Crystal said calmly. "I want readiness." Daniel studied her. "You haven't confronted Dennis?" "No." "You haven't confronted Monica?" "No." Why? Crystal considered the question. "Because once they know I know, their behavior will change." Daniel allowed himself the faintest nod. "That's accurate." They discussed procedural pathways for the next hour, quiet steps that could be taken without triggering alarm. Daniel suggested engaging an independent e-discovery consultant under attorney-client privilege. He advised reviewing server logs for unusual forwarding rules or access modifications. Crystal absorbed each recommendation without emotional inflection. When she left the office, Boston's late afternoon light had turned gold against the river. At headquarters the next morning, Monica requested a private meeting. Crystal agreed. They sat across from each other in the glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. Monica's expression was thoughtful, almost gentle. "You've seemed distracted lately," Monica said. "Is everything all right?" Crystal rested her hands lightly on the table. "I've noticed increased governance modeling," she replied. Monica smiled faintly. "That's prudent leadership. Is it reactive or proactive?" "Proactive," Monica answered smoothly. "Investors expect succession planning." "Succession," Crystal repeated. "Or substitution," the word lingered. Monica's smile did not fully fade, but it thinned. "You built something extraordinary, Crystal, but founders don't always scale with their companies." Crystal held her gaze steadily. "And you believe I haven't scaled?" "I believe the board has questions." Which board members? Monica did not answer directly. "You've been under strain," she said instead. "Long hours, public scrutiny." After the gala, Crystal's eyes sharpened slightly. "The gala," she echoed. "Yes," Monica continued, voice softening. "Dennis was worried about how you came across." Investors noticed tension. Crystal did not raise her voice. "Dennis was worried," she said evenly, or Dennis was positioning concern. Monica leaned back slightly. "You're interpreting this defensively?" "No," Crystal replied. "I'm interpreting it structurally." Silence settled between them. Monica stood first. "I want what's best for the company," she said. Crystal did not doubt that Monica believed that, but belief and loyalty were not always aligned. After Monica left, Crystal remained seated for several minutes, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. The narrator knew that at this point, Crystal's understanding had crystallized into certainty. They were building a framework to remove her under the guise of protection. Downstairs, Dennis finalized a dinner reservation for the following Thursday. Private room. 2 additional minority shareholders. He believed momentum was on his side. That evening at home, Dennis mentioned the dinner casually. "Investor relationship management," he said. "I'll handle it," Crystal nodded. "Of course." She watched him as he spoke, not with suspicion, but with careful attention. He looked confident. Confidence, she had written in her notebook, comes from a perceived advantage. After dinner, Crystal returned to her study and opened her laptop. She finalized the email draft to Daniel Brooks. Subject: initiate confidential preservation review. This time she pressed send. Within minutes, Daniel responded. "We proceed discreetly." Crystal closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. She did not feel anger. She did not feel grief. She felt alignment between knowledge and action. The architecture of her company had been designed to withstand external threats, regulatory shifts, market volatility, competitor aggression. It had not been designed to anticipate coordinated internal repositioning by the 2 people closest to her. But structures once understood could be defended. Downstairs, Dennis laughed softly at something on his phone. Upstairs, Crystal opened a new page in her black notebook. Legal preservation initiated. Proxy outreach expanding. Dinner Thursday. Monitor access logs. She paused, then added one final line. "Do not react. Build sequence." She closed the notebook. In the silence of the house, the lines of strategy were no longer abstract. They were active. And while Dennis and Monica believed they were nearing execution, Crystal had quietly entered the next phase. Preparation. If Dennis Chapman had been asked whether he loved his wife, he would have answered yes without hesitation. And he would have believed it. Love to Dennis had never excluded ambition. It simply required management. On Thursday evening, seated in the private dining room of an understated Back Bay restaurant, Dennis spoke with the calm authority of a man discussing succession, not displacement. Across from him sat 2 minority shareholders, Gerald Morrow and Elaine Sutton, both seasoned investors who had supported Chapman Health Analytics since its Series B funding round. "We're not talking about removing Crystal," Dennis said, hands lightly folded over the white linen tablecloth. We're discussing continuity planning. Gerald swirled his wine. The market reacted to the gala clip. Dennis's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. The clip had circulated among select investors. Crystal's pause before responding to his public remark about steadier hands. In isolation, it was harmless. In narrative framing, it was suggestive. Perception matters, Elaine added, especially in healthcare data. Stability signals trust. Dennis nodded. Exactly. The board has a fiduciary responsibility to anticipate risk. If at any point Crystal's workload compromises her decision-making capacity temporarily, of course, we need a mechanism in place. Gerald glanced at Elaine. You're referring to the incapacity clause? Yes, Dennis said, but only as a safeguard. He did not say that the amendment expanding reputational impairment had been drafted under Monica's supervision and filed during a batch authorization session when Crystal was traveling. He did not say that he had personally followed up with Harold Whitaker to confirm the language was acceptable. He framed it instead as prudence. We would never act without majority alignment, Dennis continued. And we'd present it as supportive. Interim leadership, a chance for her to recalibrate. Elaine leaned back. Would she agree voluntarily? Dennis's pause was fractional. If approached correctly, the narrator understood what Dennis did not fully admit to himself. Voluntary compliance was ideal, but unnecessary. Proxy alignment could override reluctance. Across town, in a discreet office suite operating under attorney-client privilege, an e-discovery consultant began quietly mapping internal email traffic patterns for Chapman Health Analytics. The consultant's name was Victor Lang. He had spent 2 decades reconstructing digital timelines in corporate disputes. His demeanor was methodical, almost clinical. Daniel Brooks observed as Victor described the process. We won't extract content yet, Victor explained. We'll analyze metadata first. Timestamp anomalies, forwarding rules, unusual deletion cycles. And this can be done without alerting executive users. Daniel asked. Yes, as long as IT compliance is cooperative. Robert Klein had agreed to facilitate limited access under Daniel's guidance. By Friday morning, preliminary patterns emerged. Victor projected a chart onto the conference room screen. This cluster, he said, pointing to a concentration of internal emails between Dennis Chapman and Monica Hayes over the past 6 weeks, shows increased activity outside normal business hours. Daniel remained silent. Victor zoomed in further. Notice here he continued a new forwarding rule established on Monica Hayes' account 3 weeks ago. To whom, Daniel asked. Victor adjusted the view. A private domain address not registered under corporate infrastructure. Daniel made a note. Later that afternoon, Crystal sat in her office reviewing quarterly growth metrics when Daniel called. We've identified irregular forwarding activity, he said. An elevated after-hours coordination between Dennis and Monica. Crystal did not ask for emotional interpretation. Content, she asked. Not yet. We'll need to escalate extraction under formal preservation grounds. Proceed. There was no tremor in her voice. After the call ended, Crystal stood and walked to the window overlooking the river. The water moved steadily indifferent to governance disputes and private ambition. Behind her, on the conference floor below, Monica addressed a team of senior managers. We need tighter operational alignment, Monica said confidently. Clarity at the top reduces volatility below. The managers nodded. Monica believed what she was saying. In her mind, she was correcting imbalance. Crystal had become insulated, she thought, too focused on architecture, not enough on optics. Investors needed reassurance. The board needed predictability. And Dennis understood positioning in ways Crystal resisted. Monica did not frame their coordination as betrayal. She framed it as evolution. Back in her office, Crystal opened the governance transition draft Monica had circulated earlier in the week. She reread a particular paragraph in circumstances where reputational risk materially impacts shareholder confidence. Interim executive authority may be enacted to stabilize market perception pending comprehensive review. Market perception. Crystal closed the document and opened her notebook. After hours coordination spike. Forwarding rule to private domain. Narrative equals sign stabilization, not removal. She paused before adding one more line. Intent disguised as protection. The narrator knew that this was the moment Crystal's internal narrative shifted from suspicion to confirmation. Not proof yet, but direction. That evening at home, Dennis appeared relaxed. He described the dinner with Gerald and Elaine as productive. He complimented Crystal on a recent policy interview she had given. He even asked whether she was sleeping well. Crystal answered each question evenly. Productive is good, she said. Yes, Dennis agreed. It's important everyone feels secure. Secure. Later, when Dennis stepped out onto the patio to take a call, Crystal remained in the kitchen listening through the faint echo of his voice through the glass doors. We're close, he said quietly. Harold just needs confirmation on one more commitment. A pause. No, she doesn't suspect. She's focused on operations. Crystal did not step closer. She did not confront him when he returned. Instead, she washed a single plate and dried it methodically. Upstairs, after Dennis had fallen asleep, Crystal opened her laptop again. Victor Lang had sent a preliminary summary forwarding rule created on Monica Hayes' account. Multiple email threads referencing board special session. Draft document titled Executive Stabilization Plan. Crystal read the last line twice. Executive Stabilization Plan. She closed the laptop gently. In another part of the city, Monica finalized a revised slide deck for the upcoming board review. Slide 12 included a subtle line graph showing founder-driven volatility index. It was based on selectively framed data points, minor fluctuations exaggerated for narrative emphasis. Monica did not view it as manipulation. She viewed it as framing. Dennis reviewed the slides the following morning. It needs to feel organic, he said. Concerned, not aggressive. Monica nodded. We'll emphasize continuity. Good. Neither of them considered that Crystal might be constructing her own parallel case. They believed momentum was theirs. By Sunday evening, Victor Lang had completed a deeper metadata extraction. One particular email thread stood out. Subject timing. It originated from Dennis's private email and was forwarded to Monica's external domain address before being copied into corporate discussion under sanitized language. Victor flagged it for Daniel. Daniel forwarded a brief summary to Crystal with a single line. We're approaching material evidence. Crystal read the message without visible reaction. She walked to her bookshelf and retrieved a framed photograph taken years earlier herself, Dennis and Monica standing together at the company's first major funding announcement. They looked younger, aligned. She studied the image for a moment before setting it face down on her desk. Not in anger, in clarity. Downstairs, Dennis was reviewing proxy commitments on his tablet. He smiled faintly. Just a few more, he murmured to himself. The narrator understood what Dennis did not: alignment built on secrecy collapses under documentation. And documentation was Crystal's language. She opened her notebook once more and wrote, Material evidence imminent. Do not interrupt sequence. Let them advance. She closed the notebook and turned off the lamp. In the darkness, two strategies were advancing toward collision, one built on persuasion, the other built on record. And only one of them was designed to withstand exposure. By Monday morning, the word stabilization had appeared in 3 separate internal documents. Crystal noticed because she was looking for it. She arrived at headquarters before sunrise, the city still muted in pale blue light. Her access badge unlocked the executive floor with its familiar, discreet click. She paused briefly outside the glass-walled boardroom, observing the long walnut table where so many strategic decisions had been shaped. She had chosen that table herself. Inside her office, she set her leather bag down and opened her laptop. An encrypted message from Daniel Brooks waited in her inbox. Extraction authorized. Initial content review complete. We need to meet. Crystal closed the laptop without replying and instead picked up her black notebook. Forwarding rule confirmed. Private domain communications. Subject line timing. Stabilization language repeating. She underlined the last line. Repetition was never accidental in coordinated messaging. It was conditioning. At 8:30 a.m., Monica entered with her usual composed energy tablet tucked under her arm. "Morning," Monica said lightly. "Board materials are almost finalized." Crystal looked up. "Are they?" she asked. Monica paused, sensing the neutrality in Crystal's tone. "Yes, we'll circulate later today." "Before or after the special session request?" Crystal asked. The question was delivered without edge. Monica's expression did not fracture, but it stilled. "There hasn't been a formal request yet," she replied. "Yet," Crystal echoed. Monica smiled faintly. "You're reading too much into process refinements." Crystal closed her notebook. "I rarely read too much," she said. Monica held her gaze for a moment longer than usual before leaving the office. The narrator understood that Monica was beginning to sense resistance, not overt, not confrontational, but structural. An hour later, Crystal sat across from Daniel Brooks and Victor Lang in a private conference suite. Victor projected email content onto a secured screen. The first message appeared ordinary. From Dennis Chapman to Monica Hayes, external domain. Subject timing date 6 weeks prior. We need to align Harold before formalizing anything. If the narrative centers on sustainability, we can avoid resistance. Crystal did not blink. Victor scrolled further. Another message. Once we secure proxy commitments from Gerald and Elaine, triggering the clause becomes procedural. Procedural? Victor cleared his throat. There are at least 14 exchanges referencing proxy alignment and contingency activation. Is there explicit mention of removing me? Crystal asked calmly. Not in those terms, Victor replied. The language is framed as interim authority stabilization founder support. Daniel folded his hands. The challenge, he said, is demonstrating intent to circumvent fiduciary duty rather than engage in legitimate succession planning. Crystal leaned forward slightly. Do they reference my consent at any point? Victor navigated to another thread. If she refuses voluntary step-aside, the clause still holds once proxies align. Silence settled in the room. Daniel met Crystal's eyes. That's significant, he said quietly. Crystal did not allow the word betrayal to surface in her mind. Instead, she evaluated leverage. Chain of custody, she asked. Clean, Victor replied. Server extraction under legal hold. Metadata intact. Crystal nodded once. Continue full preservation, she said. But do not notify opposing parties. Daniel hesitated. You understand that if they initiate formal board action first, you'll need to respond immediately. I will, she said. Back at headquarters that afternoon, Dennis convened a closed-door conversation with Harold Whitaker. Harold adjusted his glasses as Dennis outlined proxy commitments. Gerald and Elaine are aligned, Dennis said. 2 additional holders expressed conditional support. Harold exhaled slowly, and Crystal Dennis's voice remained steady. She's been distracted, the market noticed. Harold frowned. We must ensure we're acting within fiduciary bounds. We are, Dennis insisted. The clause exists for this purpose. He believed that. He believed structure justified motion. Upstairs, Crystal reviewed system access logs provided discreetly by Robert Klein. There it was. A modification request submitted under Monica's credentials, temporary review of executive-level permissions. It had not yet been activated. But it was queued. Crystal wrote in her notebook, permission review queued. Proxy alignment near threshold. Activation window approaching. The narrator knew that Dennis and Monica were accelerating. Momentum once sensed creates urgency. That evening at home, Dennis appeared unusually attentive. He asked Crystal about her day. He suggested a weekend away. He mentioned that stress could be managed more effectively with delegation. Crystal listened. Delegation, she repeated softly. Yes, he said. You don't have to carry everything? I never did, she replied. Dennis studied her face, searching for irritation. He found none. After dinner, he retreated to the study to place a call. Crystal remained upstairs, but this time she did not rely on overheard fragments. Instead, she opened her secure portal and reviewed Victor's latest update. One attachment caught her attention. Executive Stabilization Plan. Draft 3. She opened it. The language was clinical. Upon activation of Clause 4.3, interim authority transfers to Executive Liaison Dennis Chapman, with operational oversight from COO Monica Hayes. Pending health review certification. Health review certification. Crystal closed the document and allowed herself one controlled inhale. Not anger, assessment. Downstairs, Dennis's voice drifted faintly upward. Once Harold confirms quorum, we proceed Friday. Friday. Crystal glanced at the date. 3 days. She stood and walked to her bookshelf, retrieving a slim folder she had not opened in years, the original shareholder agreement signed, when the company valuation had barely touched 8 figures. Her majority voting control was secured not only through share distribution, but through a protective covenant requiring good faith determination before incapacity designation. She reread the clause carefully. Good faith. Intent mattered. Documentation mattered. Back in the study, Dennis ended his call and leaned back in his chair. "We're ready," he said to Monica over speakerphone. Friday, Monica confirmed. She won't expect it. Dennis smiled faintly. Upstairs, Crystal opened a new email to Daniel. Subject Friday. Body they intend to proceed. Prepare injunction draft. Include breach of fiduciary duty and conspiracy under governance manipulation. She pressed send. Her phone vibrated almost immediately. Understood. Drafting now. Crystal closed her laptop and sat in stillness. The narrator understood what neither Dennis nor Monica yet grasped. Acceleration creates exposure. They believed that Friday would mark activation. Crystal knew it would mark confrontation, but not the kind they anticipated. She opened her notebook one final time before bed. Friday, anticipated activation. Injunction draft underway. Evidence sufficient for preservation motion. Do not warn. Allow procedural attempt. She closed the notebook gently. In the quiet of the house, Dennis slept deeply convinced that structure and persuasion had aligned in his favor. Monica, across town, reviewed final slide decks once more, rehearsing language designed to sound supportive rather than decisive. And Crystal Chapman lay awake in the dark, not grieving, not raging, only calculating sequence. Because when power shifts quietly, it must be met with something quieter still. Documentation and timing. Friday approached with the kind of ordinary calm that often precedes structural collapse. Crystal arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. The sky was overcast, the river flat and metallic beneath a muted morning light. She carried only her leather bag and one black notebook. She did not carry visible resistance. At 7:02 a.m., her phone vibrated. Daniel Brooks. "The draft is ready," he said without greeting. "Temporary restraining order. Motion to preserve evidence. Allegation of coordinated breach of fiduciary duty and improper proxy manipulation." "Filed?" she asked. "Not yet. We file the moment they initiate formal board action." "Good." He paused. "Crystal, once this begins, it will not be quiet." "It already isn't," she replied. Downstairs in a smaller executive conference room, Dennis reviewed the final proxy count on his tablet. Monica stood beside him, arms folded lightly, expression focused. "Gerald confirmed in writing," Dennis said. "Elaine too. That puts us at threshold with Harold's alignment." Monica nodded. "The language needs to stay measured." "It will," Dennis replied. "This isn't removal. It's interim stabilization." They had repeated that phrase often enough that it felt neutral. At 9:00 a.m., Harold Whitaker circulated an official notice to the board. Subject: Special Session Executive Continuity Review. Crystal received the email at the same moment as the others. She opened it slowly. The language was restrained. "In light of recent investor concerns and market volatility, the board will convene to evaluate temporary executive authority alignment under Clause 4.3. Clause 4.3. Incapacity." Crystal closed the email and opened a new message to Daniel. "It has begun." Within 30 seconds, his reply arrived. "File now." Crystal stood. She did not hurry. She walked down the hallway toward the boardroom, her steps measured against the marble floor. Through the glass walls, she could see Dennis already seated reviewing printed packets. Monica sat 2 chairs down, tablet open. Harold stood at the head of the table. Board members murmured in low voices. Crystal entered without announcement. The room quieted. Crystal Harold began his tone careful. "We were about to convene." "I'm aware," she said. She took her usual seat at the head of the table, her seat. Dennis looked at her steadily, expression composed. "This is procedural," he said gently. "We need to address investor perception." "Perception," she repeated softly. Harold cleared his throat. "Given recent public signals and internal workload indicators, we're evaluating whether temporary delegation would benefit the company." Crystal placed her notebook on the table but did not open it. "On what medical basis?" she asked. Harold shifted slightly. "This is not strictly medical. The clause references reputational impairment. And reputational impairment is defined how?" she asked. Monica answered smoothly. "Market confidence metrics, media narrative shifts. Quantified by whom?" Crystal asked. Silence. Dennis leaned forward slightly. "No one is accusing you of misconduct," he said. "This is about sustainability." "Then why was I not consulted prior to this session being scheduled?" she asked calmly. Harold adjusted his glasses. "The board has independent authority." Crystal nodded once. "Of course it does." Her phone vibrated softly on the table. "Daniel." Filed. She did not look at the screen immediately. Dennis continued. "We've secured proxy alignment sufficient to enact interim authority, if necessary." "Have you?" Crystal asked. "Yes." "Documented, yes." Crystal finally glanced at her phone. "Case number confirmed. Temporary restraining order filed in state court. Motion includes preservation of evidence and injunction against activation of Clause 4.3 pending judicial review." Crystal looked back up at the room. "I've filed for injunctive relief," she said evenly. The words landed without raised volume. Dennis's composure faltered for the first time. What he asked? "A motion to restrain activation of Clause 4.3 pending review of fiduciary conduct and proxy coordination." Harold stiffened. "On what grounds breach of fiduciary duty?" Crystal replied. "Conspiracy to manipulate governance structure without full disclosure. Improper coordination outside standard succession protocol." Monica's fingers tightened around her tablet. "That's a serious accusation," she said quietly. "Yes," Crystal agreed. Dennis leaned back slowly. "You're escalating unnecessarily," he said. "Am I?" she asked. Daniel's next message appeared on her screen. "Hearing scheduled for Monday morning. Court orders immediate preservation of digital communications and financial records pending review." Crystal read it silently. "Court has ordered preservation of all digital communications and related financial records," she said calmly. "Effective immediately." The room shifted. Harold looked between Dennis and Monica. "Is there evidence supporting these claims?" he asked carefully. Crystal met his gaze. "There is documentation," she said. Dennis's voice hardened slightly. "You're mischaracterizing prudent governance planning." "Am I mischaracterizing the forwarding rule established on Monica's account to a private domain?" Crystal asked quietly. Monica's face drained of color for a fraction of a second. "Or the email thread titled Timing Referencing Proxy Thresholds." Crystal continued. Dennis's jaw tightened. "You accessed private communications. I preserved corporate communications under legal privilege," Crystal replied. Silence expanded across the table. Harold exhaled slowly. "This session is suspended pending legal review," he said finally. Dennis turned to Crystal. "You didn't have to do this publicly." "It isn't public," she replied. "Yet." The narrator understood that this was the moment Dennis realized she had not been blind. He had mistaken silence for passivity. He had mistaken patience for ignorance. As board members quietly gathered their materials, Harold approached Crystal. "If this proceeds to court," he said in a low voice, "the company's reputation will survive," she said. What it would not survive is concealed governance manipulation. Harold nodded once. Dennis remained seated as the room emptied. When only the three of them remained, Crystal, Dennis, Monica, the air felt thinner. You forced escalation, Dennis said quietly. You forced it when you aligned proxies without disclosure. Crystal replied. Monica finally spoke. We were trying to protect the company. From whom, Crystal asked. Neither answered. Crystal stood. Preserve everything, she said calmly. Do not alter, delete, or transfer any communication. The court order is explicit. She picked up her notebook and left the room. Behind her, Dennis remained seated, staring at the dark surface of the table. Monica whispered. We didn't anticipate this. No, Dennis said slowly. We didn't. Upstairs in her office, Crystal closed the door and allowed herself a single, steady breath. The legal process had begun. Not loudly, not theatrically, but formally. Her phone buzzed again. Daniel, opposing counsel, will respond aggressively. Expect argument that governance planning was legitimate. Crystal typed back, let them argue. She walked to the window overlooking the river once more. The sky had cleared slightly. Below, employees moved through the lobby, unaware of the structural confrontation unfolding above them. Crystal understood something clearly now. This was no longer about perception. It was about evidence. And evidence once preserved under court order does not bend to narrative. She opened her notebook and wrote, Injunction active. Preservation enforced. Next financial trace. She closed the notebook. The collision had begun. And while Dennis and Monica had prepared persuasion, Crystal had prepared record. In court, only one of those would hold. By Saturday morning, the legal language had already begun to ripple outward, quietly, strategically, without press releases or public statements. A temporary restraining order does not announce itself to markets. It travels through inboxes first. At 8:12 a.m., outside counsel representing Chapman Health Analytics received formal notice of the court's preservation directive. By 8:47 a.m., ID compliance officers had been instructed to freeze deletion protocols across executive accounts. By 9:30 a.m., Robert Klein had locked down financial archives under supervision. Dennis learned of the expanded preservation scope at 10:04 a.m. He was standing in the kitchen when his phone vibrated repeatedly, 3 messages in rapid succession. Monica, IT just froze archival permissions. Harold. What exactly did Crystal file external counsel? We need immediate discussion. Dennis read each message slowly, jaw tightening. Not in panic, but in recalibration. He dialed Monica first. She moved faster than expected, Monica said without greeting. She anticipated timing, Dennis replied. Did she access content she claims documentation? Monica was silent for a moment. Can she prove intent? She asked finally. Dennis walked toward the patio doors, lowering his voice. Planning governance review isn't illegal, he said. Proxy alignment isn't illegal. Triggering incapacity without medical basis could be. Monica said quietly. Dennis did not answer. Across town, Crystal sat at her dining table with her laptop open. Daniel Brooks on video call, and Angela Whitmore, the forensic accountant, joining remotely from Chicago. Angela's voice was calm, analytical. I've begun reviewing financial transfers flagged during metadata extraction, she said. There's a pattern. Crystal did not interrupt. 6 payments over 5 weeks, Angela continued. Consulting fees routed through a Delaware LLC Whitestone Advisory Group. Crystal's eyes sharpened slightly. Ownership, she asked. Registered agent obscures direct identity, Angela replied. But further tracing shows operational expenses tied to a public relations firm specializing in executive reputation management. Daniel leaned forward. Reputation management, in what context, he asked. Angela clicked to the next slide. Internal memos referencing narrative positioning in event of founder transition. The phrase landed without drama. Crystal absorbed it quietly. So funds were allocated to shape perception concurrent with proxy outreach, Daniel summarized. Yes, Angela confirmed. And the timing aligns with email threads referencing clause 4.3 activation. Crystal closed her eyes briefly, not in distress, but in synthesis. Financial trace, narrative preparation, proxy alignment. Daniel spoke carefully. This strengthens the breach argument. Coordinated financial activity supporting governance shift without disclosure. Crystal nodded once. Continue tracing, she said. I want full documentation before Monday. The narrator understood that what Dennis had framed as prudent continuity was becoming structurally indistinguishable from coordinated displacement. That afternoon, Dennis convened a private meeting with external counsel at his downtown office. This is an overreach, he insisted. Crystal is reacting defensively. Counsel adjusted his glasses. The court will focus on intent and process, he said. If communications suggest premeditated activation without full disclosure, the optics are problematic. Optics, Dennis repeated, almost bitterly. Yes, counsel replied, especially with financial expenditures tied to narrative management. Dennis stilled. What financial expenditures? Counsel glanced at his notes. The LLC payments. Dennis's jaw tightened. That was advisory. For what purpose? Counsel asked evenly. Dennis did not immediately answer. Back at headquarters, employees sensed tension without understanding its origin. Access notifications had shifted. IT announcements referenced routine compliance audits. Monica maintained visible composure, moving through departments with reassuring steadiness. We're simply ensuring governance clarity, she told a senior manager who asked whether rumors were circulating. Monica believed clarity would prevail. But privately, she opened her external email and reread a message from Dennis sent weeks earlier. Once we secure proxy commitments, activation becomes procedural. Narrative support will soften perception. She stared at the sentence longer than she intended to. Procedural. It no longer felt neutral. Sunday evening brought an unexpected development. Tyler Grant, Dennis's executive assistant, requested a private meeting with Daniel Brooks. He arrived at the law office visibly anxious. I'm not trying to pick sides, Tyler said quickly, but I processed some invoices personally. Daniel listened without interruption. They were labeled consulting retainers, Tyler continued. But Monica instructed me to expedite payment before board review. For what reason? Daniel asked. She said timing mattered. Tyler swallowed, and there was a draft press brief prepared in advance. Daniel's expression remained steady. You understand this may require testimony. Tyler hesitated only briefly. I understand. Late that night, Daniel called Crystal. We have a cooperating witness, he said. Crystal did not ask for details first. Voluntary, she asked. Yes. Document everything. By Monday morning, the courthouse steps were quiet, unlined by cameras. The matter remained sealed from public docket exposure beyond procedural entries. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was restrained but tense. Dennis arrived with counsel. Monica sat behind him, posture upright, expression unreadable. Crystal entered moments later, accompanied by Daniel. She did not look at Dennis as she took her seat. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with a reputation for procedural precision, reviewed preliminary filings. This matter concerns temporary executive authority activation under corporate governance clause, she began. Petitioner alleges breach of fiduciary duty and coordinated manipulation of proxy alignment. Dennis's counsel stood first. Your Honor, governance planning and proxy communication are lawful corporate activities. There was no executed activation, only evaluation. Daniel rose in response. Your Honor, evaluation becomes improper when coordinated financial and communicative actions are undertaken to construct reputational impairment narrative, concurrent with proxy threshold alignment without disclosure to the sitting CEO. The judge's eyes lifted slightly. Financial actions, Daniel gestured toward Angela Whitmore, seated behind him. Forensic analysis indicates funds routed through Advisory LLC to public relations firm, preparing narrative framing for executive displacement. Murmurs were minimal but present. Dennis's counsel objected lightly. Speculation without full evidentiary context. Daniel responded calmly. Email metadata corroborates alignment timing. The judge turned to Dennis. Did you initiate proxy outreach without notifying the CEO? Dennis answered evenly. As a board member and shareholder, I exercise communication rights within corporate governance norms. And the narrative planning, the judge asked. It was contingency support, Dennis replied. Protective. Crystal remained silent. The narrator understood that her silence in this room carried more weight than argument. The judge leaned back. Temporary restraining order remains in effect pending evidentiary hearing, she said. All financial and digital records are to remain preserved. No activation of Clause 4. 3 without court review. Her gavel struck lightly. The hearing adjourned. Outside the courtroom, Dennis turned to Crystal for the first time. You've escalated this beyond repair, he said quietly. Crystal met his eyes steadily. It was already beyond repair, she replied. Monica stood a few steps behind him, her composure thinner now, calculation replaced by something closer to apprehension. As Crystal walked down the courthouse steps beside Daniel, the morning air felt sharper. This isn't over, Daniel said. No, she agreed. But something had shifted. Dennis and Monica had believed timing was theirs. Now timing belonged to record. And record once entered into court proceedings moves according to evidence, not persuasion. Crystal did not feel triumph. She felt alignment. She opened her notebook in the car and wrote, TRO upheld. Witness secured. Financial trace strengthening. Next phase, full evidentiary exposure. She closed it gently. The slow burn was no longer internal. It was procedural. And procedure, unlike narrative, does not respond to charm. The days following the temporary restraining order did not explode into chaos. They tightened. Crystal returned to headquarters Tuesday morning to find the building quieter than usual. Conversations lowered when she passed. Eyes followed not with accusation, but with uncertainty. Leadership disputes, even sealed ones, generate internal tremors. She acknowledged no one differently. In her office, she closed the doors and opened the secure folder Daniel had shared overnight. Subject line, Executive Stabilization Plan, Draft History, Recovered Versions. Victor Lang had completed deeper extraction from archived server layers. Deleted revisions, version comparisons, timestamps that revealed what polished board packets concealed. Crystal clicked the first red-line draft. The original heading had not been stabilization. It had been transition framework contingent activation. She scrolled. A paragraph halfway down had been edited. Original language. Upon majority proxy alignment, activation of Clause 4.3 shall proceed irrespective of voluntary compliance. The revised version softened it. Activation may proceed following appropriate board review. Crystal sat back in her chair. Irrespective of voluntary compliance. There was nothing protective about that phrasing. Her phone vibrated. Daniel. We've recovered draft iterations, he said without preamble. Earlier versions are more explicit. I've seen them, she replied. There's more. Audio logs. Crystal's eyes sharpened. From where Conference Room C corporate security archives retain 30-day internal recordings for liability purposes. Monica and Dennis held 2 strategy meetings there after hours, and those recordings preserved before deletion cycle. Crystal closed her laptop gently. Review before hearing, yes. Then let's review. That afternoon in Daniel's office, the lights were dimmed as Victor prepared the playback. The screen showed grainy after-hours footage. Timestamp 10:18 p.m., 3 weeks earlier. Dennis and Monica sat across from each other at the long conference table. No theatrics, no raised voices, just calculation. Victor increased volume. Dennis's voice filled the room. Once proxies hit threshold, she can protest all she wants. It becomes procedural. Monica responded quieter. And the health angle? We won't need a doctor if reputational impairment stands, Dennis said. The gala clip did half the work. Crystal did not move. The video continued. Monica leaned forward. She won't see it coming. She trusts us. Dennis exhaled. She trusts structure. That's the irony. The footage ended. Silence remained in the darkened room. Daniel spoke carefully. This demonstrates premeditated activation strategy. Crystal nodded once. No ambiguity, she said. No. Victor added, chain of custody is intact. Internal security logs confirm recording retention policy. There's no unlawful acquisition. Crystal's voice remained even. Prepare transcript. Across town, Dennis sat in his office reviewing counsel's latest memorandum. The audio his attorney said over speakerphone is damaging if admitted. It's internal corporate recording, Dennis replied. Expectation of privacy limited, counsel answered, especially in executive conference rooms under posted surveillance policy. Dennis's jaw tightened. He had forgotten about the 30-day retention cycle. Monica called him moments later. Did you know about internal audio, she asked. Yes, he replied. Then why didn't we? Because we weren't doing anything illegal, Dennis cut in sharply. Silence followed. Monica's voice softened. Intent matters. Dennis stared at the city skyline outside his window. We framed it as protection, he said. Did we? Monica asked quietly. He did not answer. Back at headquarters, Crystal convened a short executive leadership meeting, excluding Dennis and Monica. Robert Klein sat stiffly at the table. Two senior vice presidents exchanged uncertain glances. I want operational continuity, Crystal said calmly. No speculation, no commentary. Focus on delivery. Is the board? One of them began. The board is functioning, she replied. And so are we. She did not mention the video. She did not mention the transcripts being drafted. She did not need to. After the meeting, she returned to her office and opened her notebook. Draft language explicit. Audio confirms activation intent. Narrative manipulation referenced. Evidence threshold approaching decisive. She paused before writing one more line. Do not rush hearing. Let record speak. The narrator understood that Crystal's restraint was not emotional detachment. It was strategic timing. If she released evidence prematurely, Dennis would argue narrative warfare. If she allowed formal hearing to unfold, the court would introduce it as record, not retaliation. Thursday evening brought a private mediation attempt initiated by Dennis's counsel. They met in a neutral downtown office. Dennis sat across from Crystal at a polished oak table. Monica remained silent beside him. Withdraw the injunction, Dennis began. Tone measured. We can restructure collaboratively. Collaboratively, Crystal asked softly. Yes, he said. You retain public leadership? Interim operational oversight transitions gradually. No litigation. Crystal studied him. This offer comes after proxy alignment and reputational narrative preparation, she said. It was precaution, Dennis insisted. And the audio, she asked. His eyes flickered. What audio? Crystal did not elaborate. Daniel spoke instead. We have documented discussion of activation irrespective of voluntary compliance. Dennis's composure fractured for the first time. You recorded private conversations. They were corporate recordings, Daniel replied evenly. Silence. Monica looked down at her hands. Dennis leaned back slowly. What do you want? He asked Crystal. Crystal considered the question. I want governance integrity restored, she said. Full disclosure of proxy outreach. Immediate cessation of narrative manipulation expenditures. And your resignation from interim authority consideration. Dennis stared at her. That's unreasonable. No, she replied. It's proportionate. Monica finally spoke. If this goes public, the company suffers. Crystal turned to her. The company suffers more from concealed manipulation than transparent correction. Monica did not argue. The mediation ended without agreement. The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for Monday. Over the weekend, transcripts were finalized. Financial tracing completed. Tyler Grant signed an affidavit confirming expedited payments tied to narrative preparation. Angela Whitmore delivered a clear summary linking financial disbursements to timing of proxy commitments. Sunday night, Crystal sat alone in her study. The house felt different now, less like shared space, more like divided territory. Dennis had begun sleeping in the guest room. She opened her notebook one last time before closing it for the evening. Audio admissible. Financial linkage documented. Witness affidavit secured. Hearing Monday. She closed the notebook and turned off the lamp. Downstairs, Dennis stared at his phone in the dark. He replayed the conference room footage in his mind, not as it was, but as he had experienced it at the time. Rational, structured, protective. He had never raised his voice. He had never used the word remove. But intent once recorded does not rely on vocabulary. Upstairs, Crystal lay awake, not anticipating victory. Only exposure. The slow burn had reached its structural midpoint. On Monday, persuasion would no longer compete with narrative, it would compete with record. And record once entered into evidence does not forget. Monday arrived without spectacle. No reporters waited outside the courthouse. No headlines speculated. The matter remained procedurally contained. Sealed filings limited public visibility, controlled attendance. Inside the courtroom, however, the temperature felt lower. Crystal sat upright beside Daniel Brooks, hands folded loosely in her lap. She wore navy again. Minimal jewelry. Hair pulled back cleanly from her face. There was no visible strain. Across the aisle, Dennis conferred quietly with his counsel. Monica sat one row behind her, expression composed but paler than usual. The judge entered promptly. "We are here for evidentiary review concerning activation of Clause 4.3 and alleged breach of fiduciary duty," she began. "Petitioner may proceed." Daniel stood. "Your Honor, we submit that respondents' coordinated proxy alignment, reputational narrative preparation, and contingency activation planning without disclosure to the sitting chief executive officer in violation of good faith governance requirements." He gestured toward Angela Whitmore, seated behind him. "We begin with financial tracing." Angela approached the stand with quiet professionalism. She described the 6 payments routed through Whitestone Advisory Group. She detailed how the LLC served as intermediary for a public relations firm specializing in executive transition narratives. "Were these expenditures disclosed in standard board reporting?" Daniel asked. "No," Angela replied. "They were categorized as advisory retainers without narrative specification." And the timing, concurrent with proxy outreach activity and internal discussions of Clause 4.3 activation. Dennis's counsel rose for cross-examination. "Is narrative preparation inherently unlawful?" he asked. "No," Angela answered calmly. "But undisclosed narrative preparation tied to governance displacement may indicate coordinated intent." The judge took notes. Daniel then introduced the draft history of the Executive Stabilization Plan. Victor Lang authenticated metadata and version history. He projected the original language on screen. "Upon majority proxy alignment, activation of Clause 4.3 shall proceed irrespective of voluntary compliance." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Dennis did not look at the screen. Monica did. Counsel objected lightly to characterization, but the judge allowed the version comparison. "Intent appears relevant," she noted. Finally, Daniel introduced the internal audio recording. The courtroom fell still as the grainy footage flickered to life on the monitor. Dennis's voice filled the room. "Once proxies hit threshold, she can protest all she wants. It becomes procedural." Monica's voice followed. "She won't see it coming. She trusts us." The video ended. Silence lingered longer than the playback itself. Dennis's attorney rose immediately. "Your Honor, internal governance discussions often include strategic language. This does not equate to malicious intent." The judge regarded Dennis directly. "Did you intend to activate Clause 4.3 without voluntary consent from the CEO?" Dennis stood. "I intended to protect the company from instability," he said evenly. "The clause exists precisely for contingency." Even against her objection, the judge asked. "If fiduciary duty required it," Dennis replied. Crystal did not move. The judge leaned back slightly. "And were the financial expenditures for public relations intended to shape narrative before activation?" Dennis hesitated for half a second. "They were contingency planning." Monica's eyes lowered. Daniel spoke again. "Your Honor, we also submit affidavit testimony from Tyler Grant, confirming expedited payment instructions specifically tied to timing of proxy alignment." The affidavit was entered into record. The judge reviewed it briefly. After nearly 2 hours of testimony and argument, she spoke. The evidence presented suggests coordinated planning to activate governance clause, absent transparent disclosure and good faith determination. The temporary restraining order is extended. Activation of clause 4.3 is suspended pending full fiduciary review. She paused. Additionally, the court appoints an independent governance monitor to assess internal processes. Her gavel struck softly. The hearing adjourned. Outside the courtroom, Dennis walked several steps ahead before turning toward Crystal. "You've damaged the company," he said quietly. Crystal met his gaze. "No," she replied. Documentation revealed damage already in motion. Monica stood beside him, silent. For the first time, there was no strategic framing in her eyes, only realization. At headquarters later that afternoon, Harold Whitaker convened an emergency board session, this time fully documented, fully disclosed. Crystal attended. Dennis did as well. The independent governance monitor, a retired federal judge named Eleanor Price, joined via video. Until review concludes, Eleanor said no unilateral governance action will be undertaken. Harold cleared his throat. Given current proceedings, Dennis Chapman will temporarily step back from advisory involvement, pending investigation. Dennis's jaw tightened. "This is premature," he said. "It is precautionary," Harold replied carefully. Monica remained silent. Crystal did not speak during the exchange. She did not request removal. She did not argue for punishment. She allowed the board to reach its own conclusion under evidentiary weight. After the meeting, Robert Klein approached her hesitantly. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. That evening, Dennis returned to the house before she did. He stood in the living room as she entered. "We could have handled this privately," he said. "Privately?" she asked softly. "Yes." "You drafted activation irrespective of voluntary compliance," she said. "That is not private misunderstanding. That is structural override." Dennis's shoulders dropped slightly. "You've always trusted systems," he said. "I thought I could operate within them." "You tried to operate above them," she replied. Silence filled the room. Monica had not returned with him. She had driven separately, leaving the courthouse without comment. Dennis looked at Crystal with something closer to fatigue than anger. "I never wanted to hurt you." Crystal considered that. "Intent does not erase outcome," she said. He did not argue further. That night, he packed a small suitcase and moved to a short-term apartment downtown. Crystal watched from the hallway, not interfering, not condemning, just observing. When the door closed behind him, the house felt larger, quieter, but not empty. The independent monitor began her review immediately. Emails were cataloged, financial flows mapped, proxy outreach examined for disclosure compliance. Within 48 hours, preliminary findings were shared confidentially with the board. Findings indicated coordinated proxy solicitation without CEO disclosure, narrative expenditure, misclassification, and pre-activation drafting inconsistent with good faith governance language. Harold Whitaker called Crystal into his office. "The board will request Dennis's formal resignation from any executive advisory role," he said carefully. "Monica's position is also under review." Crystal nodded once. "I trust the board's process," she said. Harold studied her. "You could have demanded this." "Yes," she replied. "But that would mirror what they attempted." Late that evening, Crystal sat alone in her study. She opened her notebook for what felt like the final time in this phase. TRO extended. Governance monitor appointed. Board reassessing roles. Structure restored. She paused, pen hovering above paper. Then she added, "No victory, only correction." She closed the notebook gently and set it aside. Outside, the river moved steadily beneath the city lights. The slow burn had reached exposure. But justice, she understood, was not in humiliation. It was in restoration. And restoration rarely announces itself loudly. It settles, quietly. The formal letter arrived on Wednesday morning. It was drafted by outside counsel but signed unanimously by the board. Crystal read it alone in her office before anyone else had access to it. Effective immediately, Dennis Chapman is requested to resign from all advisory and governance roles within Chapman Health Analytics, pending final review findings. Monica Hayes is placed on administrative leave during investigative proceedings. The language was restrained, corporate, measured. There was no mention of betrayal, no moral commentary, only process. Crystal folded the letter once and set it down beside her notebook. Outside her office window, the Charles River carried its quiet current past glass towers and steel bridges, indifferent to board votes and internal fracture. At 10:00 a.m., the board convened again, this time without Dennis present. Harold Whitaker's voice carried less authority than it once had. The independent monitor's preliminary findings are clear, he said. There was coordinated effort to activate Clause 4.3 without full disclosure to the CEO. No one argued. One board member, a venture investor who had once championed Dennis's advisory presence, spoke carefully. "We were persuaded by stability language," she admitted. "We should have demanded transparency." Crystal did not respond. She did not need apology. What she required was correction. Harold turned to her. "Crystal, do you wish to make a statement?" She considered the question. "Yes," she said. The room quieted. "I built this company on structural integrity," she said evenly. "That includes governance. I will not tolerate concealed realignment of authority. But I will not dismantle this organization out of personal injury either." She paused, eyes moving calmly across the table. "I request only that all processes be transparent going forward. That is sufficient." There was no applause, no dramatic shift in posture, just agreement. The board voted formally to request Dennis's resignation and to suspend Monica pending final findings. The motion passed unanimously. Monica received the notification in her corner office, overlooking the city skyline. Administrative leave, effective immediately. She read the email twice before closing her laptop. For 12 years, she had moved through this building as co-architect of growth. Now she would leave under review. She gathered her personal belongings slowly, 2 framed photographs, a leather-bound planner, a fountain pen Crystal had given her during their 5th anniversary as executive partners. She paused over the pen, then placed it in her bag. In the hallway, employees avoided eye contact, not out of hostility, but confusion. Monica walked to the elevator without speaking. Dennis received his letter at the downtown apartment he had rented 3 nights earlier. He read it standing by the window, city noise rising faintly from below. Resign. The word felt heavier than he expected. He had framed everything as protective contingency. He had convinced himself it was strategic evolution. But the documentation did not frame it that way. He called his attorney. "They're forcing resignation," he said. "It's not criminal counsel," replied. "But governance position is untenable." Dennis ended the call and sat down slowly. For the first time, he allowed himself to replay the conference room footage, not as strategy, but as record. She trusts structure. That's the irony. He exhaled. It had not been irony. It had been miscalculation. At headquarters, Crystal requested a company-wide leadership address, private internal, streamed only to employees. She stood alone in the main auditorium. No dramatic lighting, no script visible in her hands. Over the past weeks, she began voice steady. "You may have sensed internal tension. I will not detail private matters. But I will clarify one point: governance integrity remains intact." She paused. "No one here needs to choose sides. Your responsibility is your work. Mine is the structure that protects it." Her eyes moved across the quiet audience. This company was built on transparency. It will remain that way. The address lasted less than 6 minutes. There were no questions, but as she stepped off the stage, something subtle shifted uncertainty, settling into steadier ground. The independent governance monitor delivered final findings on Friday. The report was thorough. Proxy outreach had occurred without CEO disclosure. Narrative expenditures were miscategorized. Draft language indicated premeditated activation and independent of voluntary consent. The conclusion was clear breach of good faith governance standards, not criminal conspiracy, but structural misconduct. The board acted swiftly. Dennis's resignation was accepted formally. Monica's employment was terminated with cause. Crystal signed the documentation without visible hesitation. She did not attend the exit meetings. She did not need to. That evening, Dennis requested to meet her. They chose a neutral location, a quiet cafe near the river. He arrived first. When Crystal entered, she carried no notebook, no folder, just herself. Dennis stood as she approached. "You won," he said quietly. Crystal sat down across from him. "This wasn't a contest," she replied. He gave a faint, humorless smile. "It feels like one." "You attempted to override governance," she said. The structure responded. Dennis looked down at his hands. "I thought you were burning out," he admitted. "You've been carrying everything." "I was," she said calmly. "But exhaustion is not incapacity." He nodded once. "I never intended to destroy you." "You didn't," she replied. "You misjudged process." Silence lingered between them. The cafe hummed softly around them, cups clinking, low conversation espresso machines steaming. "I'll step back entirely," Dennis said finally. "From the company, from public association." Crystal studied him. "That's your decision," she said. He looked at her, then not with anger, not even with regret, but with something closer to recognition. "I underestimated you," he said. She considered that. "No," she replied quietly. "You misunderstood silence." They did not argue. They did not revisit history. They finished their coffee and measured quiet. When they stood, there was no embrace, no dramatic parting, just acknowledgement. Back at the house, Crystal walked through each room slowly. The air felt different. Not empty, not victorious, balanced. She entered her study and opened her black notebook one last time for this chapter. Resignations complete. Monitor report filed. Governance restored. No retaliation enacted. She paused before writing the final line. Integrity held. She closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the dark water. There was no public humiliation, no press spectacle, only structural correction. The slow burn had not ended in flames. It had ended in alignment. And Crystal Chapman remained exactly where she had always been meant to remain, at the center of what she built. Not louder, not harder, just steadier. The story did not end with resignation letters. It deepened. Governance had been restored, but restoration is not the same as repair. Structures can be corrected on paper, while fractures remain in memory. On Monday morning, Crystal arrived at headquarters without announcement. The building felt subtly altered, quieter, more observant, not fearful, watchful. She preferred watchful. In her office, she met with Eleanor Price, the independent governance monitor, for the final debrief. Eleanor's manner was direct, almost judicial, even outside the courtroom. "You responded proportionately," Eleanor said. "You sought injunction before public exposure. That matters." Crystal inclined her head slightly. "I sought preservation," she replied. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "and preservation prevented escalation." Eleanor slid a slim folder across the desk. "Board recommendations," she said. "Structural safeguards moving forward." Crystal opened the folder. Recommendations included mandatory dual disclosure for proxy outreach involving executive authority, financial categorization, transparency audits, board CEO consultation clause, prior to governance activation, independent review, trigger for incapacity language. Crystal read each line carefully. She did not take offense at the implications. "Implement them," she said. Eleanor studied her for a moment. Many executives would resist added oversight, she observed. Crystal closed the folder. "Oversight protects structure," she said simply. After Eleanor left, Crystal stood at the window for several quiet minutes. The city moved as it always had: traffic, construction, cranes, riverboats. Nothing outwardly reflected what had nearly shifted beneath the surface. Her phone vibrated. A message from Harold Whittaker. Board vote unanimous on reforms. Thank you for restraint. Crystal did not reply immediately. Restraint had not felt like virtue. It had felt like discipline. Across town, Monica Hayes sat in her apartment, surrounded by unopened boxes. Her termination package lay on the coffee table. Severance withheld pending cause determination. 12 years condensed into a legal summary. She replayed her own words from the conference room recording. She won't see it coming. She trusts us. Monica closed her eyes. Trust had been the fulcrum. She had told herself the company needed evolution, that founders eventually became obstacles, that Dennis was pragmatic. She had not considered that Crystal's silence was not naivete. It was observation. Her phone lit up with an email notification. Industry recruiter inquiry. Word traveled quickly even when sealed. Monica did not open it. Dennis meanwhile signed final paperwork, relinquishing advisory status and divesting remaining proxy alignment commitments. He had chosen not to contest further. Public litigation would damage the company, and despite everything, he still believed he had once acted in its interest. He sent Crystal a brief message. I've signed the final documents. I won't interfere further. She read it in her office and responded only acknowledged. No anger, no forgiveness offered, just acknowledgement. That afternoon, Crystal convened a smaller leadership roundtable, carefully selected senior executives who had weathered the internal turbulence quietly. I will be restructuring certain reporting lines, she said calmly, not as reaction, but as reinforcement. No one objected. Robert Klein remained CFO, but now reported audit findings directly to the board, as well as to her. Internal compliance gained expanded authority. It was not punishment. It was architecture. After the meeting, one vice president lingered. May I ask something candidly, he said. Yes, Crystal replied. Did you ever consider stepping aside voluntarily? Crystal met his gaze. No. Why? Because I was not incapable, she said. And precedent matters. He nodded slowly. Understood. That evening, alone at home, Crystal began packing, not hurriedly, methodically. Dennis had already moved out. The house once shared now felt transitional. She was not fleeing. She was relocating. Memory does not vanish simply because documentation prevails. As she folded clothing into a suitcase, her mind did not replay arguments. It replayed early years, whiteboards filled with diagrams, shared laughter at midnight coding sessions. Monica bringing coffee during product launches, Dennis defending acquisition terms in conference rooms. Those memories were not erased by misconduct. They coexisted with it. That was the quiet truth. The next morning, she signed papers transferring the house into a trust for future sale. She would move into a smaller apartment near the river, closer to the company, closer to neutrality. The board formally ratified the governance reforms at the next quarterly meeting. Minutes recorded the changes without dramatization. Crystal presented operational forecasts with the same steady cadence she always had. Revenue remained stable. Investor confidence paradoxically strengthened. Markets respond to clarity more than to secrecy. After the meeting, Harold approached her privately. You handled this without spectacle, he said. I handled it within structure, she replied. He hesitated. Do you regret anything? Crystal considered the question. Yes, she said after a moment. What that I trusted proximity more than process. Harold nodded. That's human. Yes, she agreed. But governance must account for humanity. Weeks passed. No further litigation surfaced. Dennis accepted a position at a mid-sized firm in another city. Monica relocated quietly. No press statements were issued. No op-eds written. The story remained largely contained within corporate filings and sealed records. Crystal preferred it that way. One afternoon, as she walked along the river near her new apartment, her phone buzzed with a notification from a business news outlet. Chapman Health Analytics announces governance enhancements, reaffirms CEO leadership. She read the headline once, then locked her screen. The air was crisp. Water moved steadily under gray sky. She understood something now, with even greater clarity than before. Power is rarely seized in loud gestures. It shifts in clauses and footnotes, in quiet alignments. And it is defended the same way, through documentation, through timing, through restraint. That night in her new apartment overlooking the river, she opened a fresh black notebook. Not to record betrayal, not to log evidence, but to outline the next 5-year strategy. Expansion into telehealth integration, AI predictive modeling refinement, international compliance frameworks. She wrote for 2 hours without interruption. When she finally closed the notebook, there was no tremor in her hands, only steadiness. The slow burn had not ended in spectacle. It had ended in recalibration. Crystal Chapman did not stand triumphant over fallen adversaries. She stood where she had always stood, within structure. And this time, the structure was reinforced. The formal investigation closed quietly. There was no press conference, no dramatic disclosure of internal memos beyond what had already been entered into court record. The independent monitor issued her final certification: governance compliance, restored fiduciary breach, addressed structural safeguards implemented. For most corporations, that would have been the end. For Crystal Chapman, it was an inflection point. 3 weeks after the board ratified reforms, a letter arrived from one of the minority shareholders, Gerald Morrow. Crystal read it alone. I misjudged the framing presented to me. I believed continuity required intervention. I did not ask the right questions. There was no self-exoneration in the note, no defensive explanation, only admission. Crystal folded the letter once and placed it in her desk drawer. Trust fractured does not fully return. But acknowledgement alters weight. At headquarters, operational rhythm resumed. Quarterly targets were met. Product development cycles advanced. Analysts upgraded long-term projections after governance reforms reassured institutional investors. Markets reward predictability. What they do not see is the quiet labor required to restore it. Crystal spent hours reviewing compliance architecture with the expanded audit team. She requested scenario modeling not just for external threats, but for internal realignment attempts. "What if a future board aligns against you again?" Robert Klein asked carefully during one session. "Then structure will still apply," she said. "And if structure is amended, then amendment will require transparency." She did not build around paranoia. She built around documentation. Across state lines, Dennis had begun rebuilding his professional identity. His new firm emphasized regulatory advisory, not governance restructuring. He avoided interviews. He declined invitations to comment publicly on Chapman Health Analytics. He had learned something from the footage played in court, not about legality, but about permanence. Conversation spoken in confidence can become record. Record outlasts persuasion. He wrote Crystal one final email. "I was wrong about the method, even if I believed in the rationale. I won't defend that anymore." She read it without immediate response. Hours later, she replied with 2 sentences. "I hope you rebuild with clarity. Governance requires transparency." There was no bitterness in the words, only boundary. Monica Hayes resurfaced in a smaller healthcare analytics startup months later. Her experience remained valuable, but in industry circles her name carried an asterisk. Not scandal, caution. She understood why. One evening she drafted a letter to Crystal. She deleted it 3 times before sending. "I convinced myself evolution required force. I mistook patience for weakness." Crystal received it late at night in her apartment overlooking the river. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she opened her new black notebook and wrote a single line. "Patience is not weakness. It is observation without exposure." The next morning, she replied to Monica briefly. "Leadership without transparency becomes displacement. I wish you clarity going forward. No reconciliation proposed, no hostility sustained. Just acknowledgement." 6 months after the injunction hearing, Chapman Health Analytics hosted its annual scholarship gala, again the same event where Dennis had once spoken of steadier hands. Crystal stood backstage before the program began. The chandeliers cast familiar light across the ballroom. Investors mingled. Employees laughed softly over champagne. The atmosphere felt different, not fragile, not tense. Steady. Harold approached her quietly. "Would you like to address the room personally this year?" he asked. "Yes," she said. When she stepped onto the stage, there was no hesitation. She looked across the room, filled with donors, board members, employees, and students receiving scholarships. This event honors resilience. She began. Not perfection, not performance, resilience. Her voice was calm, measured. Resilience is not loud. It is procedural. It is the decision to protect structure when structure is tested. She did not reference the past year explicitly. She did not mention names. But those who understood, understood. The strength of any institution, she continued, is not in who leads it, but in whether it can withstand challenge without collapsing into secrecy. Applause followed, not thunderous, but sustained. Afterward, several young scholarship recipients approached her. One asked, "How do you stay calm when people doubt you?" Crystal considered the question. "You document," she replied, "and you wait." Later that evening, alone in her apartment, she removed her heels and stood barefoot at the window overlooking the river. The water reflected city lights in broken lines. She thought about the early days again, about shared ambition, about trust freely given. She did not romanticize the past. She did not condemn it either. She understood now that proximity magnifies both loyalty and risk. Her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel Brooks. Case officially closed. No further proceedings expected. She typed back, "Thank you for precision." He responded almost immediately. "You handled it with restraint." Crystal set the phone down. Restraint had never been about appearing dignified. It had been about refusing escalation that would damage what she built. She walked to her desk and opened her notebook once more. Annual gala complete, investor confidence stable, structure strengthened. She paused before writing a final line beneath those entries. No public victory required. She closed the notebook gently. The slow burn had not consumed anything beyond what needed removal. No public humiliation. No retaliatory spectacle, just correction and continuity. Outside, the river moved steadily toward the harbor. Inside, Crystal Chapman stood in the quiet center of what she had built, no longer defending it, no longer reacting, simply leading it. The final legal closure did not arrive in a courtroom. It arrived in an email marked "Settlement Confirmation." Though the injunction had held and the board had acted, there remained residual civil exposure claims, counterclaims, procedural filings Dennis's counsel had prepared before ultimately advising withdrawal. Crystal had authorized Daniel Brooks to negotiate quietly. No media, no spectacle, only resolution. The settlement terms were narrow. Dennis waived any claim to advisory reinstatement. Crystal withdrew personal damages claims. Both parties agreed to confidentiality beyond court record. No admission of criminal wrongdoing. The document was 12 pages long. Crystal reviewed each clause personally. When she reached the section regarding mutual non-disparagement, she paused only briefly before signing. She did not require public apology. Record already existed. She returned the signed document electronically. Within hours, Daniel confirmed final execution. "It's finished," he said. Crystal looked out her office window at the river. "No," she replied quietly. "It's closed. There is a difference." 2 days later, the board convened one last special session, this time not for conflict, but for affirmation. Harold Whitaker spoke first. "With settlement complete and governance reforms implemented, this matter is formally concluded," he said. "We reaffirm Crystal Chapman as sole Chief Executive Officer and majority voting authority under amended transparency provisions." There was no dissent, no hesitation. A formal vote passed unanimously. Crystal did not smile. She inclined her head once in acknowledgement. After the meeting, Eleanor Price, the independent monitor whose appointment had triggered structural review, requested a brief private conversation. You could have pursued personal litigation further, Eleanor observed. Why didn't you? Crystal folded her hands lightly. Because my objective was restoration, not retribution. Eleanor studied her carefully. Few executives separate the two. Crystal's voice remained steady. Retaliation consumes focus. Restoration preserves it. Eleanor nodded once, then extended her hand. You've reinforced more than governance, she said. You've reinforced precedent. When Eleanor left, Crystal sat alone in the empty boardroom. The walnut table reflected soft afternoon light. Months earlier, this room had nearly shifted against her. Now it stood still. She did not feel triumph. She felt equilibrium. Dennis received confirmation of settlement that same afternoon. He read the document in his new office, smaller, quieter, absent the glass walls and skyline views he once occupied. He had considered contesting further. Pride had urged it. But pride, he had learned, does not survive evidentiary clarity. He signed without ceremony. When the confirmation arrived, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly. He did not frame himself as villain, nor did he frame himself as victim. He understood something more precise. He had miscalculated the boundary between strategic maneuver and structural breach. And the structure had answered. Monica received notice as well. She had expected harsher terms. There were none. Crystal had not pursued damages. That unsettled her more than litigation would have. There is something disarming about restraint. It leaves no counterattack. Monica folded the document carefully and placed it in a drawer. She would move forward, but not without memory. At headquarters, Crystal gathered her executive team one final time, not to discuss conflict, but to chart expansion. Our international compliance review is complete, she said. We proceed with telehealth integration in Q3. No one mentioned the past months. It hovered understood but not spoken. Robert Klein lingered after the meeting. I've seen leaders implode over less, he said quietly. Crystal looked at him evenly. I didn't build this to implode. No, he agreed. You built it to withstand. That evening, alone in her apartment, Crystal opened the original black notebook, the one that had recorded every timestamp, every observation, every procedural step. She flipped through its pages slowly. 10:14 a.m. Board strategy moved. 11:47 PMD plus M discussing proxies. Forwarding rule confirmed. Audio admissible. TRO upheld. Integrity held. Each line was concise, unemotional, precise. She closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf beside the new one. Future strategies, expansion models, innovation forecasts. Past and future separated by discipline. Her phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. Annual compliance audit review. She smiled faintly. Not because of irony, because of continuity. Weeks later, at a quiet industry conference in New York, Crystal participated in a panel discussion on corporate governance in high-growth companies. An audience member asked, "What's the most overlooked risk in founder-led organizations?" Crystal did not hesitate. Informal trust replacing formal process, she replied. The room fell silent for a moment. She continued, trust is necessary, but governance must not rely on it. There were nods, notes taken. No one in the audience knew the full context of her answer. They did not need to. After the panel, a young founder approached her. How do you know when someone close to you is repositioning power, he asked. Crystal considered the question carefully. You don't rely on instinct alone, she said. You review structure. He frowned slightly. And if it's already too late, it's rarely too late if record exists. She walked away without elaboration. That night, back in her apartment overlooking the river, Crystal stood by the window once more. The city hummed below, unaware of internal battles that never reached headlines. She thought about the gala months earlier, the moment Dennis had spoken about steadier hands. She remembered the flicker of laughter, the calculated tone, the assumption of ignorance. She did not resent the memory. She recognized it as the pivot, the moment when silence shifted from trust to observation. She returned to her desk and opened her newest notebook. Settlement complete. Governance affirmed. Expansion underway. She paused, then wrote one final line for this chapter. Strength is quiet until challenged. She closed the notebook gently. The slow burn had reached its apex not in flames, but in clarity. There would be no public undoing, no spectacle of humiliation, only the steady continuation of what she built. Crystal Chapman did not need the last word in court. She had it in structure. Winter came slowly that year. The river outside Crystal Chapman's apartment shifted from steel gray to a deeper blue, then to the fractured shimmer of thin ice along its edges. The city moved as it always did, unconcerned with private wars that never made headlines. Inside Chapman Health Analytics, the fourth quarter closed stronger than projected. Investor confidence stabilized. Compliance audits returned clean. Expansion into telehealth integration moved ahead of schedule. The governance reforms that had once felt reactive were now embedded into policy unremarkable in their permanence. Stability once restored becomes invisible. One morning, Crystal arrived at headquarters before dawn. The lobby lights glowed softly against polished marble floors. She rode the elevator alone, watching her reflection in the mirrored walls. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes, now earned not regretted. In her office, she set her bag down and stood at the window overlooking the river. Months ago, she had stood in this same place, knowing that something was shifting beneath her feet. Now the structure felt settled, not untouched, but reinforced. Her phone buzzed with a notification from the legal department. Final governance review archived. Case closed. She read the message once and archived it. No ceremony. Closure rarely announces itself. Later that day, Harold Whitaker visited her office without an agenda. "I wanted to say something off the record," he began. Crystal gestured for him to sit. "You were given every reason to dismantle this board," he said. "You didn't." Crystal considered his words carefully. "Dismantling is easy," she replied. "Rebuilding is not." He nodded slowly. "You could have forced resignations publicly." "Yes," she said. "But public humiliation weakens institutions." Harold leaned back slightly. "You've changed the way we think about leadership." Crystal did not respond to that. Leadership, in her view, was not philosophy. It was procedure. When he left, she opened her black notebook, not the old one, filled with timestamps and evidence, but the current one. She wrote, "Board stabilized. Audit complete. No structural vulnerabilities outstanding." She paused, then added, "No retaliation necessary." Across the country, Dennis read a Business Journal article summarizing Chapman Health Analytics' quarterly success. The piece mentioned governance reforms, briefly, neutral language, no insinuation. It did not mention him by name. He closed the article and set his phone aside. In the quiet of his new office, he understood something he had resisted for months. Crystal had never fought him. She had fought the structure he attempted to manipulate, and structure had answered. He did not contact her again. There was nothing left to argue. Monica, too, followed the company's trajectory from a distance. Her new role demanded competence without ambition beyond her reach. Sometimes she replayed that conference room recording in her mind. She trusts structure. That's the irony. It had not been irony. It had been foundation. Monica no longer misread silence. In Boston, preparations began for the company's year-end address. Crystal insisted it remain internal. No external broadcast, no press. Employees filled the auditorium, engineers, analysts, compliance officers, administrative staff. She stood alone on stage once again. This time there was no undercurrent of tension, only quiet attention. "This year tested our governance," she began. She did not elaborate. "We reinforced structure. That reinforcement will outlast personalities." Her voice remained calm. "Companies fail when power becomes informal. We will not operate informally." There was no applause until she stepped back. Then it came measured, sincere. Afterward, a young compliance analyst approached her. "I joined during the middle of everything he said. It felt unstable." "It was," Crystal replied. "Why didn't you fight louder?" She met his gaze steadily. Because loud fights leave fractures. Documentation leaves precedent. He nodded slowly. Is it hard not to want revenge? Crystal considered that carefully. Revenge is reaction, she said. Correction is intention. That evening, alone in her apartment, she poured a glass of water and stood again by the window. The river had frozen in places, now light reflecting in fractured lines. She thought back to the first night she overheard the word proxies through the half-closed door. The first time she wrote 11:47 p.m. in her notebook. The first time she chose not to confront. If she had reacted, then anger, accusation, exposure, what would have followed, escalation. Denial, counterattack. Instead, she had waited. Recorded. Preserved. The slow burn had not destroyed. It had revealed. She walked to her desk and opened the original notebook one final time. The ink had not faded. Each entry remained precise. She turned to the last page and added a final line beneath integrity held. Silence is not absence. It is preparation. She closed the notebook gently and placed it in a drawer not hidden but archived. Then she opened a new one. Next, fiscal year goals, AI integration milestones, regulatory expansion planning. She began writing without pause. There was no emptiness in her focus, no lingering resentment, only forward motion. Weeks later, as winter gave way to early spring, Crystal walked along the river path before work. The air was sharp but lighter. A passerby recognized her from a conference panel and nodded politely. She returned the gesture without breaking stride. Power, she understood now more than ever, was not in being unchallenged. It was in being prepared when challenged. She did not rebuild her marriage. She did not attempt reconciliation beyond closure. She did not seek validation from investors or headlines. She sought only structural integrity. At headquarters, she paused before entering the building and glanced up at the glass facade reflecting the sky. Months earlier, that reflection had felt uncertain. Now it felt clear. Inside, her team was already moving meetings, beginning systems, running dashboards, updating. Life continuing. She walked through the lobby without hurry. No one flinched. No one whispered. The company was not fractured. It was functioning. And Crystal Chapman stood at its center not because she had defeated anyone, but because she had refused to abandon structure when it was tested. The slow burn had reached its end, not in flames, but in quiet restoration. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic exposure beyond what record required, only a steady leader who had allowed evidence to speak, law to intervene, and governance to correct itself. She did not look back as she entered the elevator. There was nothing left to prove. The story of Crystal Chapman is not about revenge. It is about restraint. In a world that often rewards speed and spectacle, she chose documentation over accusation, process over fury, correction over collapse. Power shifted in whispers and amended clauses, forwarded emails, private dinners, and narrative drafts. And it was restored in the same quiet language. Timestamps, financial traces, preserved audio lawful injunction. Justice, when it came, did not humiliate. It aligned. If this story resonated with you, if you believe strength does not need to shout, take a moment to reflect on where you're watching from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Quiet resolve exists everywhere. If you value stories where dignity outlasts deception, you're welcome to stay with this channel. There will always be more truths that unfold slowly.